Hello and welcome to this COP26 special on Daily Debrief. I'm Siddhantani and we have a great lineup today on this deep dive into what has been a prolonged round of negotiations on climate change in the UK's city of Glasgow. We have Vijay Prasad, who was in Glasgow throughout those negotiations, Prabir Purkayastha and D. Raghunandan of Newsclick explaining some of the technical aspects of the negotiations, and my main man Prashant from People's Dispatch in studio as always. Right. So at the time of coming into the studio, negotiators were still poring over the language of the new draft agreement looking to avert the most critical aspects of climate change affecting our planet. Discussions were to finish on Friday, but sticking points remain, including coal, fossil fuel subsidies and financial aid to poorer nations. Conference President Alok Sharma, late on in the day, called for an injection of some can-do spirit. Prashant, what's the latest that you're getting in terms of an agreement and the language that's coming out?
Right, Siddhant, this is one of those moments where I'm sure by the time the show goes out, there is a possibility of a deal being struck. Now there are already people who are having fun seeing how late this summit has been, because every COP summit is late, but there are late summits and there are really late summits. So the question is, will it go to Sunday?
Right.
Those kind of questions still remain. So like you said, some key sticking points nonetheless remaining as far as these agreements are concerned. And fundamentally, I think it boils down to a very simple question, that is of justice, right? So there are all these technicalities about how, how much temperature is going to increase, what are the kind of negotiation patterns, what are the kind of global fora, all those are questions. But fundamentally, this boils down to a problem of climate justice. And one of the key issues that is still a huge bone of contention is funding.
Right.
So because poorer countries are very clear that there are two aspects to it. One, they need greater commitment of funds from the richer countries in order to adapt to climate change or in order to mitigate some of the issues caused by climate change. That's one aspect. There's also the issue known as loss and damage. Now, what loss and damage means is basically handling climate catastrophes that are already happening. And that is the difference in this COP summit, because probably in last times in 2015, that was not so big an issue. But the calculation already is that temperatures have increased by 1.1% from your pre-industrial levels. And we are seeing this impact. We're seeing this impact across the world. We're seeing droughts, we're seeing forest fires, we're seeing extreme weather events, including flooding, rains. And like we talked about on multiple occasions in the past week, the poorer countries are suffering more. So what's the proposal for loss and damage in the current draft agreement? That there will be a workshop. So there has been no concrete funding about this. There will be a workshop to discuss this loss and damage is the latest proposal, which has really annoyed a lot of the developing countries, a lot of the lower income countries, because they just see this as a way for the richer countries to escape their responsibilities. As we talked about in the past, the richer countries, especially those in Europe and the United States, basically they have emitted a bulk of these carbon emissions, which are causing global warming over historically, especially after the 1950s. So they have a greater responsibility of actually, providing the money. And that's how the economies were built. Their economies were built on fossil fuels, on this kind of extractivist policies. So they have the responsibility of actually sharing the wealth they got from that so that poorer countries can survive. Right. So nonetheless, the fact remains that these countries are not showing that amount of willpower. So that's really one major question. Now, another key question which remains is, how often do you set targets? So right now, this proposal is that every 5 years, that was a proposal earlier. So there was 2015, there was a Paris Agreement, that is COP25, Glasgow is COP26. So there was the agreement that every 5 years, people come and discuss this. So now there's a demand that it should be every 1 year. And of course, the richer countries, the fossil fuel intense countries are trying to resist that, saying that, it can't be every year. So these are some of the key issues that are really at stake. I mean, many more technical aspects as well. The issue of, what wording to use. So there's been a lot of debate going on about, how exactly do you word some clauses? Do you just say fossil fuels? Do you say wasteful fossil fuels? Or do you say coal usage, unabated coal usage? And in amid all this, we need to recognize the fact that there's also an issue of livelihoods. So you can't just sort of say that, okay, we are going to end all fossil fuels just one day. Because even then, the richer countries might have it better. But what about the poorer countries, whose economies are far more dependent on fossil fuels? So there's this notion of a just transition. And a just transition implies that even those in the developing countries, even the low-income countries, they get the chance to develop to their full potential as well. And climate change will not be used as an example to increase inequality. Right, so that's really the key issue over here. So I think many of these issues not clinched yet, still discussions going on. Finally, let's be clear, nobody's going to be really happy at the end of the day. This is one of those issues where it's become amply clear that none of these targets are going to be to anybody's satisfaction. Point number one. Point number two, the big elephant in the room is implementation.
Yeah, huge. Beyond that, beyond all the conversations and the semantic debates that are going on, what is going to happen to the real issues that people are facing on a day-to-day basis?
Exactly, right.
Yeah. So Prashant also had the opportunity earlier to speak to Globetrotter chief correspondent Vijay Prashad, who was in Glasgow for a week, reporting on some of the alternative summits and the demands of popular movements. He also weighs in on one of the positives from the past 2 weeks, a joint statement by the United States and China on combined efforts to fight climate change.
Well, Prashant, to be honest, these things, it could have been Paris, it could have been Copenhagen, it could have been any other place. There's a sense of futility, I'm afraid. The officials sitting in one part of the city, used to be a dock, by the way, converted now into a conference center, tells you a lot about the world, that the productive parts of Scottish industry, now a service center where they had this conference, not moving much of an agenda, I must say. Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland, spoke with great passion and feeling about the lack of movement. She was angry that Saudi Arabia was cutting out words like gender, words like human rights from the document. You had the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, speaking again, as she did at the UN General Assembly, from the heart. But otherwise, Prashant, there's a canned quality to all of this, and there's very little advance. It seems like they want us to forget the 1.5-degree pledge and now invent another degree pledge. Let's just remember before we go further that if it's 1.5 degrees average, it's a lot hotter in parts of the world, in India, in entire belt of Africa and so on. It's a lot hotter. The droughts in Iraq will be much worse. It's not really 1.5 degrees. That's the average global temperature.
Absolutely. In this context, of course, the surprise event was the US-China announcement of common measures they would take. Now, of course, people have pointed out that this is more of a statement of intent. There is not so many specifics, but nonetheless, the fact that these two countries sort of coming together to speak about this issue was, at least in some ways, a positive step.
It's very positive. Look, anytime countries that are in the midst of a clash like this, a clash that the United States started to impose from the Obama administration, anytime we're in this kind of situation, it's very good for them to talk to each other. But there were two important things that were going on inside that agreement, which I think bear notice. The first thing is that they did mention that they needed to collaborate on climate and that they would both do more. I think this is very significant. China has already actually made a great number of statements. It'd be interesting if the United States honors this. They've, in a sense, Prashant, put their honor on the table. But there is something very specific, and I don't understand why there's a dismissal coming in many places of this. They talked about methane. Methane is the second most polluting, let's call it what it is, a greenhouse gas. Carbon is number one, methane number two. Methane reflects agriculture. It reflects what's happened to so-called animal husbandry. These are big producers of methane. They kind of factory production of animals for food. So I thought that was important that they put that on the table. There was not much of any discussion of methane at COP26 in Glasgow. So I was actually pretty happy to see that, Prashant, because it raises the question of agriculture, which was not discussed at all, really. Even on the day when they were supposed to be discussing agriculture, seemed to me they were discussing supply chains, they were discussing liberalization of finance and so on. They weren't really talking about the food system, the way in which agriculturalists, such as the Indian farmers, are impacted. 30% of the land in Iraq is not being farmed. Sorry, only 30% of the land in Iraq is being farmed this year as a consequence of the drought. None of that was on the table, but it was good to see that they had put methane on the table. So I would not dismiss this. I think it's important just formalistically that they wrote a statement together, and it's important on an actual point that they raised the issue of methane.
Right. And slightly pivoting from that topic, Xi and President Joe Biden are expected to meet on Monday, which is what's a virtual meeting. It's, considering the situation right now in the globe, considering the temperatures that have been rising in the figurative sense as well, this is Very important meeting. And another important statement, of course, from Xi, where he said that we must be careful against the return to Cold War rivalries and Cold War mentalities. And this is something you've also been working on a lot. You've been talking about a lot. So could you maybe also take us through what you see as, the possibilities, if there are any good possibilities right now?
It was odd. Right after the US and China produced this joint statement on climate, Jake Sullivan, the spokesperson, made a comment that the United States is planning to create a framework. He was awfully vague for countries in the Asia Pacific region around a new economic plan. Now, remember, United States has tried to produce economic free trade area in Asia, across the Pacific, and so on. Trump pulled out of the most significant one. India is not a party to that either. But the United States has been a no-show in many of the East Asian free trade kind of discussions. Now, Jake Sullivan says, we're going to make this happen. And he used language which indicated that China is not welcome. Well, Mr. Xi addressed the APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. At APEC, he said, look, we should not be returning to the days of blocks. Let's all engage with each other and so on. Trying to, in a way, backpedal from what Jake Sullivan said. Sullivan then addressed the Australian Lowy Institute, where he was asked about AUKUS, the military agreement between Australia, UK, and the United States. And the funny part of that, Prashant, is he was asked about how you're going to create a framework that introduces US interests and advances US interests when you've annoyed France so much. And Jake Sullivan said, well, there are learning curves here and so on. I don't think there are learning curves, Jake. There are contradictions. The United States is actually facing a serious challenge. Many of the countries in East Asia have integrated economies with China. It's going to be difficult for them to get into an exclusionary economic bloc. So I think the United States is not serious about this. There were no details presented by Jake Sullivan. It was a throwaway remark. Mr. Xi's comment comes right after it appears that he's going to have a third term as the leader of China. This is very significant. So they're going to have to deal with Mr. Xi for a long time. And I don't think the United States is actually preparing itself in a serious way for that.
Thank you so much, Vijay. We'll be following these issues as well. Back to you, Siddhant.
All right, sticking with the theme, some of the themes that Vijay brought up there, including this important 1.5 degree mark, we spoke to our resident experts, NewsClick's editor-in-chief Prabir Purkayastha and D. Raghunandan of the Delhi Science Forum, on some of the more technical aspects on this front.
Given the budget that we have left, and given the commitments already made, covered under the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs,
which is the Paris Agreement commitments.
Paris Agreement commitments of each country. If you discount that, the amount left is extremely little. So if COP26 is asking people to go beyond what Paris Agreement has said, it leaves almost nothing. So it is known, whether you go by carbon budget or you go by cumulative flows of emissions, that the chances of reaching 1.5, as far as COP26 is concerned, COP26 has not taken us any further than what we were at the time of Paris, just marginally different. It's now estimated that before COP26, if you continued along the lines, even given the NDCs of countries, you are looking at a 2.7 degrees rise.
To quickly tell our audience,
yes,
or viewers, when you said NDCs, is nationally declared commitments.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Now, with all the additional commitments people have made, cajoling and twisting their arms, etc., even though some people are saying in Glasgow we've done well, we've got this, we've got that, the current estimates are instead of 2.7 degrees, you may hit 2.4.
Okay.
Which is not doing anything to your 1.5 target. The 1.5 was constantly being emphasized, saying even 2 degrees is too much. If we allow it to reach 2 degrees, we are going to have unacceptable damage. So we need to bring it down to 1.5, because that's what the Paris Agreement said, that we want to reach well below 2 degrees, perhaps try for 1.5.
Again, for our viewers, the point is when you have 1.5 degree average increase in temperature, which is what it really is, then it is possible and it is probable that there would be areas, particularly in large parts of the world which are already hot, to see a temperature rise which is about 2, even 3 degrees. And that for a lot of these places might make it almost impossible to live in these spaces.
Yep.
And this is really the challenge. And in fact, one of the problems of the global warming scenario is those countries, like as you can see, the United States, of course, the European Union, if you put them together, they also have a very large contribution.
That's right.
If you take these countries, which are really what would be called the colder countries,
Yeah.
they have exhausted many times their carbon budget.
Yes.
And effectively, therefore, those who are in the tropical regions,
Yeah.
like Africa, large parts of Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, South Asia, all of them have very little budget left. But
right.
they are going to be hit the hardest. While
right.
countries which are cold, which have also taken up a major part of the carbon space, will have, in fact, unfortunately, less consequences. And that's why they seem to be quite complacent about it.
Well, just two things I'd like to add on that. First is this year, with the heat waves and the forest fires that we saw, particularly in North America, cities, villages and towns, even in Canada, have experienced temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius.
Which is unthinkable.
Which is
for them.
unthinkable. So even the temperate zone countries, which are well into the cold regions, have experienced all kinds of impacts. The heat waves, the forest fires in North America, the floods in Northern Europe have been incredible. And in fact, it brought home to these colder climes. They earlier thought this is a problem that's going to hit them. The developing countries,
poorer countries in the global
the
south,
tropics, and etc. But no, this time it's come to hit them. The second point is about COP26 and the budget. I think the biggest mistake at COP26 of all the countries, led of course by the US and its friends in the developed world, is that the focus has gone off 2030. And the US has succeeded in a sense in shifting the focus to 2050 by this whole debate on net zero by 2050, etc. The point is, if you really wanted to make a dent on emissions, on the budget, on cumulative flows, the focus has to be on the medium term emissions till 2030. If you don't do that, then whatever you promise in 2050 is going to do no good.
And finally, while it may not be clear yet if there are any heroes to emerge out of this summit at all, the villains are pretty obvious. The Climate Action Network yesterday announced the Colossal Fossil Awards to honor some of the countries which have had the most terrible record at the summit. Prashant, highly ironic these awards are. Take us through what the point of this exercise is.
Right. I think it's very much simple to say that, and the winner is Australia. So we talked a couple of days ago on this show about Tuvalu, which is a small country on the verge of sinking, right?
Yeah.
And very difficult situations. Very close is Australia, of course, and Australia has one of the highest per capita carbon emissions in the world. Okay, so I think it's number 2 after Saudi Arabia. It's Saudi Arabia, Australia, and the United States. Now, Australia doesn't have a huge population, but nonetheless, its per capita emissions, emissions per person, is extremely high, and it's relatively well off. Despite all this, the fact is that Australia came to COP26 with what somebody described as a brochure. So rather than a plan, there was just a brochure, right? And there was no concrete, idea about what they wanted to do. There was no idea of concrete climate policy. It was just a series of statements by the Scott Morrison government. And this has really annoyed activists across the world who see Australia as an example of exactly the kind of policies that should really not be followed on this front. So it's no surprise at all that Australia got the Colossal Fossil Award. Apparently, the only redeeming thing about Australia was that the coffee at its counter at COP26 was pretty good. So That's a blessing.
You wonder where that coffee came from.
Good question, right? And funnily enough, I believe the fact that at least if I'm not mistaken, okay, that was in the UK's case. But again, a lot of horrible records, including its policy on coal, including the fact that many activists have identified Australia as one of the biggest stumbling blocks to a proper agreement being reached. So I think somebody pointed out that earlier Australia used to hide behind other countries because some of the bigger emitters had a very similar position. But now even countries like the US seem to be slightly inclined to change. So Australia's position on this is all the more exposed.
Right.
And it's deeply depressing to see that a country which is, like I said, relatively well off, which has a much lower population, and which is emitting so high, nonetheless continues to forego its responsibilities, especially when countries around it are sinking.
Suffering.
Exactly. And then, of course, number 2 on the list is, no surprise, the United States, who has been named in the award list for its very poor record on funding. Now, it's an important thing to note because 100 billion per year was a promise that was made in 2009 that for climate related work there would be 100 billion per year fund.
Right.
This money is not in yet. This money is not expected to be in by until 2023. So we are like miles away from any kind of financial justice, so to speak. And the US has a huge role to play in this lack of funds. As we remember, Donald Trump walked out of the Paris Agreement. Now, Biden is back, but that doesn't change the fact that Trump walked out of it. And as we've discussed over here, who knows, if Republicans elected the next time, will they walk out once again of the agreement? Will they go back on some of these commitments for the sake of the domestic industry, for the energy industry? All of these are big questions. So whether the US is treaty capable on this matter, big question. And number 3, of course, on the list of colossal fossils is the UK for its pretty bad handling of the whole summit in terms of some of the logistical issues, but also in terms of, I think, the presidency and Boris Johnson especially having very little credibility as a global leader when it comes to climate change, especially if you look at his record on COVID, for instance. So I think the whole right-wing leaders across the world facing this problem that, you can bluff and buster as much as you want, but at the end of the day, do you have the credibility to actually convince people whose lives are at threat? Many of these speeches, many of these people, low-income countries, their lives are at threat. But is there any credibility at all for these big countries is really the question. So colossal fossils, all 3 of them. And sadly, the unfortunate part is there's probably no punishment or anything punitive for this. So
and also that so much of what happens in the future is dependent on these countries and the decisions and their willingness to change.
Exactly.
Right, fair enough. Thanks, Prashant, for all of that. That'll do it for this episode of Daily Debrief. We'll be, of course, looking at some of the wider impact or the fallout or when the actual agreement comes out as well. You can get more details on all of these stories on our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and follow us on all the regular social media channels. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next week. Goodbye.